We once looked at and read an article about a Belgian teen who spent 46,000 in free-to-play in-game currency in a game called Game of War Fire Age a few years back. It was by a young teenage boy who's bought over 9 million gold pieces that amounts to $46,000 in credit by using her mom's credit card information, which he took from just one purchase of ebooks. It brings into the question the idea of, is it ethical to have in-app purchases because such an event has occurred, especially because he spent such an exorbitant amount of money just from one click in one small game. It calls into question the idea of the boy's motivations, exactly what caused this, the emotions behind it, the reason behind it. Was this game truly valuable to be able to spend over $46,000 on it? Was it truly worthwhile to spend so much real currency on virtual currency?
And now this leads to a discussion of what decision making is in general. Well, in this situation, there are really two sides, the consumer and the developer side. So any big business wants to make money. All they want is to make a profit. And especially video games, their main goal is to make money from the consumers. Now, this concept of having purchases inside a game is nothing new. This really is, an era of in-app purchases in which almost every popular game has microtransactions in which the consumer plays the game but needs more resources and therefore spends real-life money on virtual money or virtual assets. Now, corporations really use this concept of psychology to influence their consumers. And the main branch of psychology is this foot-in-the-door effect that really guides how we behave and how we make decisions. Now, the foot-in-the-door effect is essentially the concept of us as consumers or as individuals taking small actions that eventually escalate into bigger and bigger actions. And this was really predominant in an experiment that Friedman and Fraser once did. Essentially, there were two experimental groups. One being a group that would be offered a large sign that said "Drive carefully," while the other group was offered a smaller sign that also said "Drive carefully." Now, in their experimental results, the group with the large sign, a majority of the households said no, while interestingly enough, the households that were offered a smaller sign said yes. And over time, the group with the smaller sign were offered bigger and bigger "Drive carefully" signs. And from the data, it was shown that once households were offered a smaller sign, they'd be more and more apt to get bigger and bigger signs. And this really reflects the foot-in-the-door effect, in which even though initially the big sign was often rejected and often looked down upon, once you take a couple of steps, it'd be easier and easier to make bigger and bigger decisions. Essentially, that foot-in-the-door effect.
So in regards to the whole concept of decision-making, two primary forces are at work here: emotion and reason. Emotion is really the subtlety of how one exactly feels about a choice, and reason is the conclusion that is reached through logic. Now, in the whole process of decision-making, these two forces are constantly at work, both synergistically and also antagonistically. These two forces both check each other and also encourage each other. In regards to actual consumer-based decision-making, there's an entire industry called consumer psychology that works with businesses in order to best manipulate the balance between these two forces of knowledge. The primary consumer-based process, known as the dealer approach, which is similar to the foot-in-the-door effect, dictates that the first time an offer is administered, it is done so for free, which thus entices these consumers to be much more emotionally and also rationally receptive to future offers.
It leads us to a new question, a second-order question, if we must, that asks us, is it ethical to manipulate the emotions and reason to profit? And kind of leads us to idea of a concept of philosophy and how it controls the decisions we make. Especially because Emotion and reason in general are both motivators for certain behavior. Whether a behavior is ethical or unethical can be determined by the emotion and reason based motivation behind each behavior. It leads us to wonder what types of philosophy, what certain beliefs can lead us to determine certain behaviors over others. It is a set of ideologies that controls the decisions we make. It is an important part in this discussion.
So looking at this from the producer's approach, or the app seller's approach, there are two philosophies that we can look at here. We have the philosophy of Spinoza and the ego. Now, Spinoza's philosophy dictates that the most ethical and good path to life is to follow your own self-interest whilst avoiding any potential harm to others that one might encounter. Now, these sellers, from Spinoza's perspective, are in fact ethical because they are following their own self-interest toward gain and profit, and yet they are never intending to harm consumers. And as such, this is an ethical action. However, we can also look at this from the perspective of Epicurus and... Yes, Epicurus. So, Epicurus states that the good path is by following pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, once again, from Epicurus's perspective, this is in fact ethical because these producers are following pleasure by promoting their sources of income, whilst avoiding pain by, once again, promoting their sources of income, but avoiding poverty. However, as I stated before, they are not seeking to harm others. They are not intending to harm others. I don't believe that ever would come up as a discussion point. But as such, this is an ethical action by both the philosophies of Spinoza and Epicurus.
More on this philosophical discussion, there are also the philosophies of Bentham and Mill and their ideas on utilitarianism. And there's also Plato's common good. Now, this really boils down to the relationship between the consumers and the developing company of, the video games and whatever corporation is selling things to consumers. So utilitarianism is essentially the concept of focusing on the results. Now, if there are more positive results than negative results, then the action is an ethical decision. So likening this back to the Belgian teenager's decision in purchasing the in-app purchases and the corporation's decision to have these in-app purchases, both parties seem to benefit. The corporations, they're seeking to get profit, and by having these extra little purchases in their game, they are making a profit. And in some cases, they make a lot of profit from certain consumers spending a lot. Now, on the Belgian teenager side, he really wanted these resources from the video game, and by purchasing a lot, he was able to benefit a lot, whether it be emotionally or rationally or whatever the case is. He did benefit by having some sort of benefit from purchasing these in-app purchases, whether it be virtual currency or another aspect of the video game. Additionally, this can be extended to Plato's common good, in which the concept is based on everyone benefiting, and that also reflects both parties benefiting, the company profiting and the consumer getting whatever he wanted.
This entire discussion can in fact be even more expanded into a abstract and gestalt form by stating the question of how emotion is exactly related to reason in regards to decision-making and influencing people. I, for one, believe that emotion is much stronger than reason in regards to the balance of decision-making. In this first example, the emotional gratification of gaining the upper hand on a challenge that this young teenager had been facing for quite some time strongly overruled the rational thought that this might in fact be a lot of money to be used on a mobile game. But if we were to look at this from a more physiological and scientific standpoint, we might first note that this person from the first example is in his teens, meaning that his brain was still developing. In regards to neurological development, there are two structures in the brain that during teenage development and puberty, They swell to pseudo-astronomical sizes, but they also take over much of the decision-making process. These two systems are the entire limbic system and specifically the amygdala. These are two structures in the brain that are incredibly closely intertwined to decision-making in the brain. Looking at this from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense, as emotion, evolutionarily, is much more closely tied to twitch survival or fight-and-flight response, and is thus far more influential toward rapid impulse decision-making compared to reason. And this impulsiveness is closely intertwined with the cultural implications of being a teenager. But in general, emotion causes a person to feel a certain way about decisions, and this is a stance that is much more deeply entrenched in a person's experiences than a rationalized viewpoint, and this is why appeals to pathos are so much more effective at winning people over than either those to ethos or logos, because pathos and emotion are so deeply grounded in experience that they are effectively part of that person. Well, if we look at this from a totally different example, not just in-app purchases in video games, let's go as far away from this as possible. Let's go to protecting the environment. Now, the main argument is that people want to save the planet because of sustainability or, to protect the sanctity of the environment. But this isn't quite true. In general, people really want to protect the environment because they just want to save the cute animals. These animals they make us feel good about ourselves emotionally. Not just about ourselves, but about the world in general. In fact, this is why programs such as animal ambassadors and environmental mascots exist at all. They seek to spread awareness and caring about the environment by showing people the cutest animals that live there. They just tug on their heartstrings. Well, more specifically, if we were to look at the giant panda, which lives in the mountainous regions of southern China, this is an organism that really only fills a tiny niche in its habitat. It doesn't impact all that many species, other than perhaps the bamboo population. However, it is considered the mascot for the entire region because it has emotionally appealing characteristics, almost in many cases childlike characteristics. Big eyes, general lack of coordination, large head to body ratio, and this thus invokes many of the emotional appeals that even consumer-based industries use in their products, of appealing to childlike sensibilities. Basically, at its heart is we want to save the giant panda, but in order to do so, we will have to save the entire ecosystem to do so, thus encouraging us to save the planet in order to specifically save the cute animals. If we were to look at this from a totally different example compared to either of those last two, for example, we could look at the flower industry. Now, last Valentine's Day, I was trying to buy some flowers for my girlfriend, and I looked at this one website, and they offered 100 Persian lilies for $20. And yet, later in that same page, they offered 18 roses for $40. Now, in buying flowers for someone you love, you can choose to either look cheap in front of someone that you care about, or you can go for the much more expensive option and have a much higher chance of attaining emotional reciprocity for that cared-for person, and flowers are thus tokens of emotional currency. Even though reason would dictate that spending more for fewer flowers is completely nonsensical, the emotional appeal that much higher-end flowers have thus drives emotion to dictate decision-making in regards to the flower industry. Going back to the first example, though, we could in fact extrapolate to video games in general. Now, video games as an industry relies heavily on emotion to overrule reason in regards to consumer choice. Like in the area of consoles, I simply ask, why would you buy a new console when the slightly older one is still perfectly usable and it plays many of the same games? It simply defies reason. But if we were to look at two particular video game franchises, Assassin's Creed by Ubisoft and Call of Duty by Activision, these are two long-standing franchises with long histories and loyal fan bases, but in recent years they have begun to rely much more heavily on the loyalty of said fan bases, as they have released more and more games with shorter and shorter development periods. Now, reason would state that these new games would most likely not be really worth the money given how short their development time was, and yet the loyal fans feel a strong emotional attachment to these franchises. Well, they grew up with them, and thus have a hyper-pathetic, nostalgic relationship with them. Their emotional connection drives them to buy every single new installment without fail, regardless of how many bugs or fundamental flaws the games might have. This complete defiance of reason thus shows why emotion is far stronger than reason in regards to decision making.
Why, yes, emotions do have some presence in decision making, but I believe that reason is really a dominant force in how we make decisions and how we behave, and that reason is far stronger than emotions. Now, considering this opposite point of view, emotion is a strong way of knowing, but really it's reason that guides us. So physiologically, much of the brain is dedicated to reasoning and decision making, especially things like the prefrontal cortex and many of the lobes of the brain. And every stimulus we get is monitored by how we think, and in the end, it's what we reason and how we reason, and that defines how we act and react to certain situations. The impulses, for example, are based on reason. Even though they are driven by emotion, they are based on reason. It's reasonable that we fight or flight in front of a threat. And so, even though we might not be consciously reasoning in our head, it's a subconscious reasoning process. Now, going back to the beginning, the first situation, in the Belgian teens' purchase of the in-app purchases, in-app purchases give rise to access to resources and virtual content that allows people like the Belgian teenager to progress in the game. And, you know, although spending that much money on one game is probably a little too excessive, the teenager did reason that if he were to purchase these in-app purchases, he would find success in the game, he would progress and do better in the game. And that is a showcase of reasoning in that there is a benefit to him spending money, and he sought that actual gain by acting the way he did. And this concept of getting a gain really defines the reasoning in the reasoning aspect of decision making. Now, this can be extended to applications such as the environment, for example. I'd like to pose a question: why are so many people now starting to get committed to the environment? It's really a dichotomy between short-term and long-term usage of resources, of the environment, of just survival in general. So right now, a lot of the resource usage we have right now is short-term, whether it be fossil fuel consumption or just consumption of the environment in general. And right now, it's really clear that our short-term usage has been really detrimental to the environment, because it's becoming increasingly clear that we are destroying the environment, and that probably it will bring doomsday to us in the future. And so the reason why we want to protect the environment is based on reason. We want to have the environment for future generations. We want to preserve biodiversity. We want to preserve it for society. And it's just reasonable that we conserve the environment. Take renewable energy, for example. A lot of people nowadays are switching to solar energy or just hybrid cars or electric cars, and it's really based on reason. And for example, although they are really expensive at first, in the end, it's really cost efficient to transition into renewable energy. Over time, the cost basically pays for itself, and someone who is devoted to renewable energy pays less and less in time. And additionally, by preserving our resource usage, we have less of an impact on the environment. More sustainable usage basically means less use of resources, less deforestation, less destruction, and just a better impact on the environment. Overfishing, for example, has been a really big problem for many of the coastal countries and regions in the world. Now, if we keep overfishing, basically the fish population will dwindle and collapse in the future, and that will be a huge crisis for many people of the world. And so it would make sense, it would be reasonable to make regulations, laws, or just reductions in consumption to better preserve the fish populations. And that's how we combat overfishing, by going for the long-term gain through reasoning. Now, applying this to the flower situation, yes, the gain from buying flowers is emotional, but there's a conscious decision and awareness that it is a gain, in that when you buy a flower for a significant other, you gain something. That's where reason kicks in. For example, buying the pack of lilies will not really do much for getting affection from a significant other. But the reason why one would buy 18 roses instead is that the cost you get, or the benefit you get from buying these roses, is far outweighs the benefit you get from buying the lilies. And that's why many people opt for fancier packages, more expensive packages, because they know that they'll get more in return. And that basically means that buying that is more cost effective and showing and reciprocating affection. Now, going back to the concept of video games in general, it's really reason that defines how consumers make decisions and purchase these video games. Consoles, for example, get a lot of scrutiny with reasoning and how people buy and purchase them. Take the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Slim, for example. Inherently, they are exactly the same in terms of specs, meaning that there's really no difference in gameplay. They have the same RAM, the same processing power, the same hard drive, the same everything, except that the PlayStation 4 Slim is new and better in quotation marks. It basically runs slightly better as a machine, and it's slightly thinner, and so people would rather spend $300 for that better quality of life game than to stick with the old console. Now, in terms of video games themselves, why is it that people always camp outside every November for the new Call of Duty or the new Assassin's Creed game? It's because it makes sense that with these new games, that's where the video game community will transition to. Why would you play Black Ops 2 when everyone is playing Black Ops 3? It's because the community is changing, and if you want to actually play games, you would buy the new games in order to play with people. And so players know the rationality behind the pattern of these games. They know that if they buy the new games, they'll be able to play the games more, and it's really just a conscious, rational decision.
However, just as we can consider reason as a more important motivator than emotion, or emotion as a stronger motivation, it's possible for emotion to be an element reason, to augment it in a sense. Emotion and reason can work together. How can this be possible? Let's take the environment, for example, one of the first examples that we pushed out as a discussion. Reason tells us that by protecting the environment, we increase the sustainability of our natural resources. The environment retains the diversity it has, which could possibly bring benefits to future generations. We may never know the medical benefits or the other benefits if we eliminate species without further study. For example, a frog in the tropical rainforest could have been used for a certain disease, for certain cancers that we could have prevented. By not protecting the environment, we also risk the potential consequences that could occur as a result of our ignorance. Known as the precautionary principle, if one small mistake in destroying the diversity could destroy an entire ecosystem or an entire biome. This is a primary reason of why we need to retain the sustainability of our natural resources. At the same point, profit at the cost of the environment is a strong motivation based on reason as well. After all, our natural resources still have many years to deplete. Our lives won't last long enough to see it end. If we can increase the amount of logging and increase the revenue, for example, in the logging industry, there's little need to care about the reduction of hardwood forest after we die. The hardwood industry is extremely profitable. Just Indiana alone as a state brings in $16.6 billion a year since 2010 at $51 just for a board foot of wood. We won't see the effects of our overconsumption, so it has little effect on our lives. So why is sustainability a stronger reason than profit in some cases? It's because it's augmented by the emotional motivation. The emotional impact of reducing our natural resources, destroying diversity. The cute little animals that we ignorantly eliminate is a powerful aid to the reasoning of sustainability. It adds on to the already powerful reason to retain the sustainability of natural resources and creates a strong motivation for the certain decision to maintain our environment rather than destroy it. The emotional motivators, in addition to the reasonable motivators, may sway our decision to move from profit to sustainability. Another example are flower sales. Even though giving more expensive flowers to our friends and family has an emotional impact of not looking cheap, an emotional motivator based on our impressions and reputations. It is a strong motivator entrenched in reason as well, in that cheaper flowers are much more cost-effective than expensive flowers. For example, 100-person lilies, as we once said before, is only worth $20 compared to 18 roses for $40. However, reason and emotion can still work together, in that by buying more expensive flowers, the emotional payoff is much better. Others may reciprocate with expensive benefits in return. It's reasonable to spend exorbitantly in order to expect greater returns, and it also takes into account the emotional impact the more expensive flowers give, as well as the feel-good emotions we feel as a result of giving high-quality items to our loved ones. In this way, emotion and reason work together to cause us to buy more expensive flowers than cheap ones, because the payoff is just so much better. Once again, emotion and reason can work together to motivate one behavior over another that is purely based on only emotion or reason. For example, in video games, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the Game Boy Advance by Nintendo was a game that was a large part of my childhood. It had a quirk where the trading cards you could buy gave you power-ups to aid you in your quest to save Peach. Reasonably, it was a completely unnecessary perk, given that beating the game was still possible even without these extra power-ups. It was cheaper to not buy these trading cards. However, at the same point, these cards gave you power-ups unobtainable in certain levels and provided a huge aid for those who maybe could not beat the game easily. It would be reasonable to buy these trading cards, which are not too expensive, in order to complete the game and understand the whole story. Moreover, this motivation is strengthened by the emotional impact of obtaining trading cards. The cards have nice images of each of the characters of the game, and also offer the appeal of memorabilia to increase my satisfaction in game experience. I'll be able to enjoy the game more with this extra feature. As a result, I would choose to buy these cards to be able to actually complete the game and feel good about it for attaining artwork for certain characters as a bonus. This way, emotion and reason can work together.
But if you actually look at that first example, it's pretty obvious that his emotion overpowered his sense of reason, and it pushed him to buy way more in-game currency than his budget or reason in general should have allowed.
So is it ethical for these corporations to include these in-app purchases for consumers to potentially make a mistake and over abuse? Well, when considering this, it's really appropriate to allow companies to provide such an easy way to spend real currency for virtual currency, in that both parties can benefit, while sometimes there can be some negative drawbacks. And it's really hard to tell because it really balances the ideas between reason and emotion. For one, it can be argued that reason will always prevent people from buying in-app purchases, and it's really the fault of the consumer. For example, the Belgian teen, if the emotions get out of control. However, it can also be argued that emotions are naturally stronger than reason, and they can constantly overpower a sense of reason. Therefore, by allowing these one-click purchases in game and allowing consumers to fall prey to the companies due to their weakness of emotion and reason.
It is hard to determine exactly which motivator is stronger, or if they naturally work together, or they keep each other in balance. As such, it's hard to determine whether or not companies are unethical, because we cannot concretely assume they are wrongly appealing to our emotions under the idea that our reason adequately holds us back.
But how do we know?
That's a discussion for another time.